Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. As you can see with all of the icons, there's a lot of developments over the past 24 hours, so let's dive straight into it. We start out in the direction of Kostiantynivka, where the Russians have managed to gain a foothold in the Dacha area in the northern parts of it. The Russians have just recently, yesterday, captured the northern parts of Kostiantynivka, which has allowed them to cover the southern flank of the Dacha area, providing enough fire support for the Russians to launch an operation east of the Dacha area to gain a foothold within it. And now the battle over the Dacha area will begin. The Russians have an advantage when going through the Dacha area compared to moving through the open field, in that it will provide some sort of cover for the Ukrainian fortified positions just west of it. Therefore, the Russians will be moving through the Dacha area before fighting over the fortified positions. But the fighting over the Dacha area signals that the Russians may start operations in the north, again south of Pobeda, towards the northern part of the fortified positions north of Kostiantynivka. This advance by the Russians within the Dacha area was geolocated with this footage here. Moving on to the Pokrovsk section of the front line, the Russians have advanced in three separate directions. South of Savitne, where they've managed to capture a fortified position of the Ukrainians northwest of Petusha, where they're attacking both from the northwestern direction, but also from the northeastern direction. Following the capture of Komishivka, just north of it, the Russians have managed to gain control over the forest line to the north of Petusha, and are now advancing towards Petusha itself from the northeast and northwest. The Russians are moving as fast as they can to gain control over the positions of the Ukrainians, cutting off the fortified positions along the Vovcha river line to hit the Ukrainians while they're retreating from them, and if they don't retreat from them, then they plan on encircling them. So we see that the Russians are moving to push the Ukrainians as fast as possible down to Karelivka, at the same time as the fighting continues in a western and southern direction near Novohrodivka, where the Russians have started storming the town itself and the fortified positions just outside of them, while fighting takes place over the heights northeast of Selidove, as well as the Russians having cut the E50 highway and are fighting down south along their fortified positions. We see heavy fighting all across the front line, with the main fighting taking place here in the Pokrovsk section along the direction of Novohrodivka, Selidove, Rodivka itself in the north, and the Vovcha river line to the south. All of this as the Russians plan on moving towards Kalinove before going onwards towards Karlivka and fighting along the fortified positions to gain control over the heights. Russians are here launching two operations at the same time, two separate offensives. The first one is an offensive towards Pokrovsk, which has slowed down since the second offensive began, and that is in a southern direction to cut off the Ukrainian defensive positions down south of Karelivka all the way down to Kurahove. The Ukrainian objective here is to hold the line as long as possible and prevent a Russian breakthrough, and the Russian plan is to cut this off by cutting off the connection between Karelivka to Kurahove up to Selidove, by moving along the fortified positions and the high grounds, cutting off the entire village chain located between Karelivka and Kurahove, to then cut them off completely from any sort of supply. This will allow the Russians to gain control over a significant area with little battle. The Russian plan is to gain full control over the area between Karelivka and Kurahove, creating a large buffer zone northwest of Krasnohorivka following the Russian capture of the city, which will allow the Russians to then further develop offensive operations towards Pokrovsk, as they'll be able to release a lot of units that are fighting in this area, where there's a lot of open fields that have to be covered, and there's a lot of fortified positions that had to fight through, and the city of Krasnohorivka itself will all be freed up to fight over Kurahove to the south, Selidove in the center, and Pokrovsk in the north. In the Toretsk section of the front line, the Russians have advanced north of New York in the direction of Nelipivka, but have advanced a bit further, capturing another street. The objective of the Russians here is to slowly push along Nelipivka upwards along the Kryvyi Toretsk river. At the same time, the Russians are likely planning an offensive operation towards the fortified positions northwest of New York, as it is located on the high ground overseeing this entire village chain along the river line. In the north, the Russians have managed to capture Pivnishne, which has allowed them to gain full control over the suburb here southeast of Toretsk. At the same time, fighting takes place over Druzhba just north of it, and the Russians are trying to get a foothold here on the outskirts of Toretsk in the apartment complex area. Though heavy fighting continues to the east of Toretsk as well. In the northeast of Druzhba, along the Canal line, the Russians have managed to capture the entire canal here to the south, leaving only the area between Ivanivska in the north and Kuryomivka in the south remaining under Ukrainian control, and what is north of Ryorivka. This means that the Russians will now be focusing right now on gaining full control over the canal area in the Klishchivka section of the front line, where we now see that the Russians have made an advance in the heights and forest area northwest of Klishchivka, further securing their positions within the town. We see heavy fighting continues both along the canal area and the Toretsk section of the front line, where the Russians are both pushing to storm Toretsk itself and the southern flank of it, as well as the suburbs to the east of the city. In the Chestov Yar direction, the Russians have managed to expand their foothold in the northern parts and lost control over one of the crossings in a Ukrainian counterattack. The Ukrainians here are trying to eliminate the Russian crossing along the canal, while the Russians are trying to expand it. The issue the Russians are facing with having control over the foothold is that just because they have a foothold, it doesn't mean that they are able to easily supply. The Ukrainians can still launch a lot of artillery and FPV drones along the roads, especially if there's only one crossing. The entirety of Ukraine's artillery and FPV supply can be focused on that small area, which makes it very difficult for Russians to expand their footholds. The Russians would need to create a large enough area where they can cross and a large enough area where they can spread their forces to avoid taking heavy casualties within such a smaller area. Therefore, the Russians are fully working now on expanding their foothold, and the Ukrainians are focusing on limiting the crossings of the Russians. Moving further north in the direction of Vyemka, the Russians have expanded yet again here to the west of the railway. The Russians here are slowly moving in the direction of Vyemka, both from the south of the railways and now from also the north of the railways. The objective of the Russians here is to gain control of Vyemka and move further along the railways towards Siversk. This will also allow the Russians to expand in a western direction, where they'll move along the first lines towards Pereysne, Kuzminivka, and so on, to combine with the assault from the south. If the Russians focus all of their forces in one direction, it is easier for Ukraine to deal with it, but if they spread across a larger area, it will improve their abilities to conduct offensive operations. Further north in the Kupiansk section of the front line, the Russians have expanded south of Pishane and to the northwest of the town. The Russians are slowly moving in the direction of the fortified positions east of Novosinove, where the Russian objective here is to gain control over the fortified positions and flank the Kupiansk direction from the south, together with offensive operations in the north by Sinkivka. The Russians here seems to be focusing on multiple areas. They're focusing on the Serbets River near Stelmahivka until they gain full control of it. They're also moving to gain control of the fortified positions here in the mid-area between Stelmahivka and the Uskid River line. At the same time, they're moving towards the fortified positions here to the north of Pishane, east of the Uskid River line. And they'll likely develop their offensive operations in the direction of Sinkova here by the Uskid River line and northwards along the highway towards Kupiansk, then combine it with an assault from the north of Sinkivka to attack the Kupiansk itself from three separate directions: from the south along the Uskid River line, from the east along the highway, and from the north along Sinkivka. In the Kursk section of the front line, the second wave of Ukraine's offensive is in full swing. They've managed to secure the eastern suburbs of Sucha with the control over Dmitrievkov, as well as gain control over Agronom, as well as the remaining parts of Martinovka here in the eastern parts along the Sucha front. The Ukrainians here are slowly pushing along the entirety of the front as they constantly launch new attacks day by day. The Ukrainian objective here is to expand their control over the Sucha section of the front line and simply gain control over more territory and more villages. In the north, the Ukrainians were spotted in the forest area north of Rusko-Poroshne, where we see this footage here of a FAB bomb landing on the forest area, and these FAB bombs have such a wide range of effects, which allows them to heavily bombard large groupings of forces with a singular bomb, especially if they are out in the open. Just to the west of this, the Russians are counterattacking in the Malaya-Lugnia direction, where the infantry managed to reach these buildings in the central parts of the village, which would signal full control of it under the Russians. Instead, we see this footage here of an American-made striker shooting at the Russians within the buildings. So we see that the Russians are attempting to advance, but the Ukrainians are constantly counterattacking with their own vehicles to prevent such advances. Further west of this position, the Ukrainians have been seen to launch operations near Ulgovka and Koronevo, where in the direction of Ulgovka we see this geolocated footage of a Ukrainian vehicle on fire. The crew survived, as at the end of the video we see a single soldier moving out of it, so at least someone survived. But we see that the Ukrainians are losing vehicles out in the open from all of these assaults they're constantly launching. At the same time, there's this geolocated footage in the direction of Koronevo, where 3 Ukrainian vehicles drove up to the river line and wanted to cross over to the central parts of Koronevo. However, 2 of the 3 vehicles were hit by direct strikes, and the third one stopped moving after the first strike. So we see that the Ukrainians were hit during their movement across. I'm not sure what sort of weapon was used here. It seems to be too big of an explosion for it to be artillery, but it was very accurate and it hit at a very high rate of fire. This means that whatever it is very effective for the Russians to stop these Ukrainian advances. Completely demolished the vehicles, and this just shows that the Ukrainians trying to advance into open fields, yes, they do advance regularly where they capture a lot of areas, but this is not at a low cost. We constantly see footage every single day of dozens of vehicles destroyed and dozens of soldiers lost in the battles. If I were to show all of it, I would simply get demonetized. But we see additional news, and this is a very interesting claim, that the Russians actually hit with an FAB bomb the town of Lukhiv here to the northwest of the Kursk region, and the report stated that this was a ammunition depot for the 47th Mechanized Brigade. And that is a very interesting claim, because so far the 47th Mechanized Brigade first entered fighting in the direction of the Zaporizhia front during the Ukrainian summer offensive of last year, and then they went to the Avdiivka section of the front line to start defending following the fall of Avdiivka, where they have constantly been in fights from Berdishi here in the east, and then all the way throughout to Pokrovsk front. And then now, if they are suddenly rotated to the Kursk region, that means that they'll be involved in the offensive operations there, or whatever is left of the 47th Mechanized Brigade. This is a general trend with the Kursk offensive. The units that the Ukrainians are using in the Kursk offensive are the most elite that they have available. But this is a huge issue for the Ukrainians in the east. And that is the case due to the fact that the Ukrainian defense strategy, as I've previously explained in an old video, is to have defense in depth where they have multiple lines of defense. If we take a look at the Pokrovsk front, we can see that there are multiple lines of defense. The Russians have to break through one line after another. An example is directly west of Pokrovsk. Pokrovsk itself was a line of defense. Following that, there was an additional line of defense by Ivanivka. There's one additional by Serhivka, an additional one here west of Hrudivka towards Novohrudivka. There's one to the south of Hrudivka along the east of Selidove. There's one here to the east of Ukrainsk, and there's one to the west of Ukrainsk. We see several lines of defense that the Russians have to break through. These are all lines manned by regular infantry, mobilized personnel. They are not any sort of elite force, they do not have elite weapons, they are not even prioritized for artillery and sending additional soldiers. Instead, what allowed the Ukrainians to defend was their elite brigades. The 47th Mechanized Brigade is one of those, so is the 80th and 82nd Air Assault Brigades, which are both used in the Kursk offensive. We see that these units are the ones that are most prioritized, both with Western weaponry, up-to-date weaponry, a lot of ammunition, the best trained personnel sent to Western nations to be trained, and additional training in Ukraine. Everything is perfect for those soldiers. The units are even allowed to recruit Ukrainians themselves to set up schools where they recruit and train mobilized personnel that they seem and deem to be promising. These are the most elite units, and they get preferential treatment by the government to be able to conduct their missions. Now, they have been working in defense where they act as mobile groups. They go from front to front where their objective is to hit and run. If the Ukrainians see that the Russians are making a breakthrough in one section of the front line, they send one of these elite brigades to stop their advance. Once their advance is stopped and the regular mobilized forces have established the next line of defense, they'll withdraw until the next breakthrough. This is what we saw in the direction of Berdishi. The Russians made a breakthrough through Stepova towards Berdishi. The Ukrainians deployed the 47th Mechanized Brigade to slow down and allow the mobilized forces to establish the next line of defense, and then they were withdrawn from it. Then the Russians made a breakthrough by Ochersene, it re-entered and then left again. By Pokrovsk, it re-entered and then left again. And that is the general trend. Every single time we saw new Abrams being destroyed, it was after a new Russian breakthrough. So the Ukrainian objective was simply to stop a breakthrough from developing too much by launching or making use of the elite brigades. If the Ukrainians use up all of the elite brigades in the Kursk region, then there simply is nothing to stop a new Russian breakthrough. And this is why we are seeing the Russians capturing New York within such a small time frame. This is why we're seeing the Russians capturing more than 100 square kilometers in the Pokrovsk section of the front line, because the Ukrainian strategy has been broken by the Kursk offensive. So the biggest thing that allows the Russians to advance at a faster pace right now is the Ukrainian Kursk offensive, where they're sending all of their elite units to be out in the open fields to be hit by Russian artillery, FPV drones, FAB bombs, and everything else that they have available out in the open, away from fortified positions and away from the safety of the Donetsk front. And that is exactly what I expected from General Syrskyi, and this is exactly why he's called General 200. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.